He saved a baby from the river. The next day, it appeared with its family. That's the line people remember when they tell the story. They like the neatness of it. Rescue, repayment, mystery, a neat ending you can pass along with your camp coffee. It sounds tidy on the outside. The truth never fits a neat line, but the river remembers, and so do I. It was June of 1994. Snowmelt had the river angry that spring, white-bellied and fast, the kind of water that chews up logs and spits them back. I'd been out checking a culvert before breakfast, damp and half awake, boots sinking into the saturated shoulder of the gravel road. The smell of the river that morning was sharp, like cold iron and wet cedar. I heard the racket before I saw the shape, frantic splashing, a small shadow thrashing against the current. I dropped my pack and waded in. The current wanted to pick me up. It slid cold under my thighs and grabbed at my calves. I saw a hand then, or something like a hand, more human than animal, long fingers gone pink from the water. The thing clung to a broken branch and was being carried toward the far bank, where the river ran under a low cliff. It was small, hair plastered to a narrow face, eyes blown wide like a child's. People talk about eyes as if they are only reflective. These were different, patient, too old for a small body, like the same sorrow I used to feel looking at Linda's picture. They looked straight at me. I grabbed it under the armpits. It was heavier than I expected, not a limp sack, but weighted with tense muscle and fear. Its breathing stuttered against my neck. For an instant, as I hauled it in and turned, it looked at me, and this is what I still see when I close my eyes. There was a tiny, deliberate nod, not the desperate flail of some terrified thing, but a brief tilt of head that said, in the only language it had, "Thank you." I wanted to think it was a monkey, a pet someone had let loose. Out here in Washington, strange things happen. There were rumors and hunters and boys with better imaginations than sense. I said to myself, monkey, escaped animal, exotic pet. It was the kind of rationalization a man uses when sight and belief are at odds. But the head tilt, so human it made my throat tighten, didn't fit those words. I wrapped it in my jacket on the riverbank. It curled against me like a baby. Its hair was the color of wet spruce, and it smelled like the back of a cabin in the river. It made a low sound, a short rhythmic hum, half bird, half rattle, that I would later learn to read like punctuation. It clutched my shirt the way my daughter had as a toddler before Linda, but I had no daughter. That reflex was only mine now, something I found when old habits were all I had left of a life that used to include another heartbeat at the bedside. I carried it the 2 miles back to the house because there was no one else. The truck wasn't the best idea, but the cab was warmer than the dawn. I had a blanket, a spare thermos of coffee, a wood stove that took stubborn, unseasoned logs and turned them into a quiet heat. I set it on the kitchen table next to the sink, where the old wall phone hung like a relic no one used anymore, its cord curling like a question mark. I tried to be practical. I poured water on my hand and wiped the muck from its face. Its eyes tracked me. It watched my fingers like it was learning the limits of my body. At home, the house is what it always was, a cluster of rooms that remember Linda's laugh. I keep her things folded in a box in the closet. I keep the radio tuned to the same station she liked, country songs that seemed to fit the creak of the porch, if only to prove to myself that the ordinary could still exist. Grief makes a man build routines like fences. Routines mean something. The routine that morning was to find a towel and a bowl, to watch the little thing breathe in the warmth of the wood, and decide what to do next. It didn't behave like an animal I knew. It sat upright, knees pulled to its chest, fingers picking at the towel, and every so often it would press a thumb to its sternum, in a motion I later recognized, touching the chest, a claim of self. It watched me with a steady attention, as if it catalogued the shape of my hands and the small soft noises I made. Once, when I hesitated, fumbling the coffee, it lifted a hand, a sloppy, tentative raised palm, and put it against the glass of my kitchen door like a child learning what a window is. The gesture looked rudimentary and deliberate at once. It was a greeting, or perhaps a test. I drove the thing a few miles down to town, because what else was there to do? To see if anyone knew of an escaped primate or a missing pet. The general store smelled like cleaning oil and cinnamon. Mrs. Fletcher, who runs the register, peered over her bifocals and said nothing useful. A man at the counter asked if I was hauling a raccoon. My answer was the embarrassed shrug of a man who has seen too much and yet not enough. A veterinarian 2 towns over said they couldn't keep wildlife without permits, and to call Fish and Wildlife if it still looked wild. Calling Fish and Wildlife felt like arranging for a species to be measured against bureaucracy. There are forms for everything. By the time I got back, twilight was already flattening the valley.
The small thing, baby if you want to give it a name like that, was awake and cleaner, though it still shivered in spite of the stove. I left the back door cracked and put some bread on the table. It sniffed, took a small cautious bite, then reached up and touched its chest. Touch chest, self. Then it looked at me as if asking, will you? I should have kept it. Part of me wanted to. We are a species that hoards warmth. In those early hours, I gave it a short name in my head. I thought about putting it in the spare room with a mattress and a radio, but something older than my loneliness warned me. This was not mine to keep.
This was not something you could fix with a blanket and a tax deduction form. So when it found the crack in the door, it slipped out like the shadow of a thought and vanished into the pines. It didn't run. It slid away with such quiet surety that I could have sworn the night swallowed its footprints. I slept badly. I woke with the taste of river on my teeth. There is a certain kind of waiting that hangs heavier than fear, anticipation loaded with 1,000 small negotiations. I made coffee and picked up a hammer to check a loose board on the porch. The dawn was thin and the fog sat like breath over the meadow. That's when I saw the prints. They told me my back porch had been visited. The boards where I set my toolbox were disturbed. The imprint of a boot in the mud left by my neighbor's delivery truck was flanked by circles bigger than a dinner plate, then an oval with long grooves like knuckles pressed into it. They headed to the line of trees where the land drops into the old swale. Whatever left those marks had approached close enough to my house to decide if I was friend or enemy. On the low fence post by the woodpile, someone had placed a straight branch upended like a signpost, a clean stick with one notch carved into it. I remember the exact way it balanced, neither threatening nor casual, intentional. A week later, if there had been a human foot traffic, someone would have put a rock or a can to mark property. This was a language I had only begun to learn. The notch in the branch matched the small chip of wood I had found on the kitchen table when I was wiping coffee off the counter, the little curls of pale wood that looked too carefully made by an instrument and too careful to be random. I had thought then it was nothing. Now the branch said something. In those first hours, my brain offered up options like a man pulling clothes from a drawer. Prank, bored kids, raccoons. But I'm a man who reads the land for a living. The river, the wind, the tracks, they don't lie because they are not invested in what you believe. They are invested in what actually happened. There was a sound that night I cannot unhear, walking that was too light to be human for that size, yet deliberate. My dog, a stubborn mutt named Hank who dislikes everything that isn't me, lay at the foot of my bed and lifted his head, low and uneasy. Hank refused to go outside. He refused to look at the woodpile. He stared at the door and let out one long indrawn breath that meant, in his language, trouble. I went onto the porch in my slippers and stood under the thin glass of the porch light. The night smelled of cold pine and wet earth. The forest made small noises, a branch shifting, the scrape of something across bark. I thought about going for a gun, about yelling, about turning on every light and making a show. Instead, I listened. A shadow swung past on the edge of the clearing and stopped. Two long eyes caught the porch light and held it like a question.
Then it dipped and moved back into the dark. Whatever it was, it did not pound the door or shout. It made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a drum, a low, measured vibration that pressed into my ribs. I remembered then the little hum it had made on the kitchen table. Punctuation, communication. By morning, I had decided to test it. You test animals in your own language, the language that does the least harm to both of you. I left food in a brown paper sack on the stump by the edge of the tree line. Bread, a corner of fried bacon, an apple, things that smell like hand and home. I wrapped the sack loose so it wasn't a trap. I left the back door unlocked as a promise that I was not a threat. I didn't have to wait long. The thing that came to the stump at dusk was not alone. They stepped from the pines like a tide, one shadow folding into the next. The family was not the ragtag of eyewitness legend. They moved with a cohesion that read like a family used to each other's weight. A large one went first. It stopped at the edge and watched the food for a long moment, head tilted in that same knowing way the baby had nodded on the riverbank. It smelled deliberate and careful. Behind it came two medium-sized shapes, and then the smallest of all, the one I had rescued, peering out from under an old bough, its hair less plastered now, eyes wide and bright. The small one put a hand to its chest, and then raised it toward the larger ones as if to say, "I am here, I am safe." For the first seconds, none of them moved toward my porch. They remained in the shadow line between field and forest, big silhouettes with a softness to them. Up close, they were nothing like what the boys in town traded in their dares and tall tales. Their faces had bone and breadth, thick brows and the curve of mouths that could look at once like a frown or a smile. The tall one, broad shoulders that folded down into a thick neck, moved his head slowly and with a measured grace that belonged to animals who had to be careful about every step. He put a huge hand up, palm turned outward. It was a mirror of the small one's earlier gesture. Raised hand, peace. Something in me melted a little at that. For all my forestry sense, I am not immune to spectacle. The sight of that huge palm, the simple, deliberate gesture of greeting and non-aggression, broke a part of the crust that had sealed over the grief and routine. I set my jaw and made no sudden motions. Hank, who had come out to peer from the back door, lay down and pressed his body flat. He seemed to understand the difference between something that could be chased and something that could not. The big one stepped forward slowly, each movement considered. When it put its hand on the stump where I had left the bread, its fingers were enormous and sure. It sniffed the paper, then the air, then the stump. There was intelligence in those small checks, a method to the approach.
It picked up a curl of coffee-damp paper, held it to its nose, then laid it down again as if not wanting to be rude. Then, and I will never forget this, it reached into the bag and took one small piece of bread, the way a person might take a spare loaf from a communal table. It touched its chest before eating. Touch chest. Self. Ritual. Someone who makes a habit of the land notices ritual the way a musician notices a rhythm, because ritual carries meaning beyond utility. I had a moment, one sharp and animal, that I feared for the small one. The big one's sides heaved as it watched the baby slip forward, glide into the clearing with the tentative stride of a child, the rescued one moving with a new confidence. The family watched it eat, and the big one looked at me. There was a slowness to that look, like a man turning a key when he is not sure whether to open the lock. Then it lifted something to its mouth and made a low sound that could have been a laugh. The small one turned, and with a deliberate motion, walked to the edge of the stump and put its tiny palm to the wood, and held it there, like a signature. The big one reached behind itself then and produced a piece of wood. It was not the crude, weathered stick by the fence, but a small carved branch, smoothed at the edges. It was simple, a line cut deep enough to be felt, a notch here and there. The big one set the carved piece on the stump and put its hand on it, palm down, as if pressing its name into the air. Raised hand. Peace. Then it stepped back, as if whatever exchange had been made was complete. What happened after, whether I had the authority to claim anything in return, is hard to pin down. It left me feeling both foolish and grateful. There was a gesture of thanks, foreign and simple, and then they retreated into the trees, them a living curtain folding closed. For a long time after they were gone, I sat on the porch and held the small carved branch in my hands. It was not polished. It bore the scent of moss and damp earth, and where a notch had been carved there was the soft residue of sap. I touched my chest with 2 fingers, the way the baby had. It felt like the beginning of a sentence I did not yet know how to finish. People ask me why I didn't call anyone then. If I had called, what would I have said? Hello, this morning 2 adults and the 3 juveniles of an unclassified primate species visited my yard and left a carved branch. Fish and Wildlife would have come like auditors. Trucks and cameras would have come. There would have been a list of boxes to check and an appetite for what is novel. A thing that is alive and belongs to a forest does not do well in the glare of other people's curiosity. The question of evidence is a moral one. What do you owe to a living thing when proving its existence means possibly destroying the life it already has? Another part of me, the practical, forever forester part, saw the carved branch for what it could be, a message or a token of what the creatures had taken. Maybe they were tracing me as much as I was tracing them. Maybe they were assessing. The only way to learn was to keep a steady hand and watch. I told no one. That night I wrapped the carved branch in an old towel and slid it into the drawer with Linda's letters. I wasn't ready to make a story of it, and even if I had been, I had no language that would hold what I felt. The next morning the stump was clear. The pile of wood where I'd stacked the sack was untouched. On the porch door, somebody, something, had left a single, almost polite scratch, like 3 long fingers pressed against the paint. It read like a mark on a ledger. Noticed. You probably expect there was instant friendship after that,
A series of nightly visits and slow learning and tears and moral awakenings. There were nights like that later, but not yet. The days after the family appeared were a careful negotiation between curiosity and caution. I left food at the stump for 2 days, a gesture more to test my own heart than anything else. Small things came back, like pine cones or a length of vine woven into a crude bracelet. Once, the little one left a pebble the size of a marble, smooth and dark, set like an offering on the doorstep. Touch, chest, self. They were naming themselves through objects. My life narrowed and widened at once. I walked the property more often. I checked the culverts and measured stream flow because that was something I knew how to do, and doing work steadied me. I mended fences, stacked wood, and in the pauses between tasks I thought about Linda. She had a way of finding life where other people saw only work, feeding a fledgling on the hearth or leaving a bowl of milk for a stray tomcat. I used to think she did it to prove she was bigger than grief, but what she was really doing was teaching me how to notice. When I told this to myself as memory, my hands would go to the cedar shelf by the stove, where Linda's photograph sat in a simple frame. I don't know when the grief became less of a fist around my ribs and more like a band I carried, a constant, true presence. The small visits, the carved sticks, the pebble on my step, they fit into that band like new stitches. A man learns to carry what is not his to solve. There were signs that something else watched us besides the family, prints that ran wider than the biggest boot I owned, broken branches high in the canopy where a human wouldn't reach, the smell of wet fur on the wind in the morning. Once I found a sliver of slate with marks on it, shallow lines that could have been a child's scratchings or a map. I picked it up with my gloved hand and held it to the light. The slashes looked deliberate enough to be language. I left it back where I'd found it because I wanted the act of leaving it there to be part of a conversation, not an excavation.
On the 6th day after the river, something else happened that I had not expected. I came out of the house at dawn and found, nailed to the post of my mailbox, a small, flat bit of carved wood nailed in place like a prayer card. It was shaped roughly like a leaf and bore 3 notches in a pattern I had started to recognize. Touch chest, raised hand, 2 lines. When I picked it up, my fingers trembled. It said, in the only way it could, "We remember you saved one of ours." That evening I set a light on the porch and sat with a mug of coffee until the sky went black. I thought about calling someone then, about confiding in Tom Patterson from Fish and Wildlife, the man who grew up down the road and whose father used to fix my truck. But I did not call. To call would be to move the secret from the forest to the world, and secrets always change when they are told. I had already seen how the simplest kindness might ripple into something I couldn't control. Maybe there are people for whom proof is everything. Maybe there are people for whom proof is a coffin. Hank, who has a habit of wanting to be near any living thing, leaned his head back against my knee. The radio hummed. Somewhere down the valley, a cow lowed. The forest itself seemed to breathe in expectation. I felt like a man on the lip of a decision, a sort of slow-motion point where every small thing matters. They came that night, as they had the first time, and stayed longer. The family moved close enough to the porch that I could see the pattern of their breathing under the hair at their collarbones, the occasional blink of long, dark lashes. The big one, who I would later call Ridge for reasons that will come, stood a little off to the side and watched me with a focus that felt more like inspection than curiosity. The small one, who clung to the edge of the woods, made the small rhythmic hum that had become its punctuation. At one point, the big one lifted his hand again, the raised palm, and I, knee-jerk and foolish with the intimacy of the moment, lifted my own in return. It was the simplest of exchanges and the most dangerous. For a second, we were 2 slow things recognizing each other's boundaries. Then the big one did something no human had done that evening. He took a small stick from his own belt, if one could call it that, it was more a woven strap across his shoulder, and placed it on the stump. Not a crude stick, but a carved item with a pattern like a wave. He pressed it down and then, very deliberately, touched his chest. Touch chest, self. The gesture was no longer just a survival tick, it was a naming. He looked at me, and the motion was an offering. I picked up the carved branch. It was warm from his hands. The pattern felt deliberately arranged, lines and notches that, to me, meant nothing more than a statement of craft. I put my hand to my chest in the only answer I knew. We were speaking without words. For all of my life, I have been careful with words, because they can be loud and clumsy. This exchange was not clumsy. There was a closeness to it that set something loose in me. I let my breath move slow and ordered. My thumb rubbed the notch on the branch, and I thought of Linda and the long summers we had stacked hay, and the way she would whistle when she was pleased. I felt ridiculous and unafraid at once.
They did not come near enough to touch the threshold of the porch. The big one never crossed the invisible line. He respected the threshold the way a man respects a cemetery. But the carved branch in my hand was a beginning. Later, much later, later that summer, later in a different ledger page of my life, I would learn that gift exchange is a form of diplomacy. Giving and receiving slows down the world enough to make negotiations possible. That night, though, it was simply the start of a strange, wordless friendship. I wrapped the branch in a towel and put it in the drawer beside Linda's letters, feeling like I had smuggled something holy into an ordinary place. I slept poorly that night, but differently than I had the previous weeks. It was not the raw, sleepless sorrow that used to wrap me. It was a new shape of wakefulness, weighted with purpose. When you rescue something, you become liable to its story. A man keeps what he rescues, not because he owns it, but because he has been given a debt. That debt changes the man. If you're the sort of person who likes the kind of stories I tell, long, slow ones that taste like the kind of work that wears calluses, you might want to hear the rest. If that's you, stick around. I have a lot to tell. But know this before we go any further. What followed was not a parade of miracle proofs. It was a slow, careful unspooling of boundaries and gestures, tests and small mercies. It was a lesson in what it means to be given another life to shield. The next morning I woke early, the way men who have a purpose do, and walked the line where we exchanged our small gifts. The stump was bare. The notched stick was gone. In its place, someone had left a different thing, a smooth, flat stone with a shallow circle carved into it. The circle had a tiny groove at its edge, like a mouth. Underneath the stone, pressed into the earth, were prints. Not the wide, blunt prints I had seen before, but a pattern of deeper, longer impressions that led toward the creek, then back into the stand of firs. The tracks vanished as if they had been swallowed by the roots themselves. Whoever had left them had returned to somewhere I could not follow without making a road. At noon that day, I sat on the porch with a clipboard and sketched the prints the way I might sketch a tree's wounds. I am not a scientist. I am a man who reads the land. What I recorded were the dimensions and the spacing and the impression of weight. I put the slate out to dry and labeled it with the date. June 12, 1994, I wrote, my pen hesitant.
I did not tell anyone. The ledger with that writing stayed inside my top drawer, behind the letters in the carved branch. And that is where I leave it for now, with the stone and the prints and the knowledge that the river had delivered something strange into my hands. The family had come the next day, as the title says, because some stories, even messy ones, begin with truth. The problem with truth is that it is only ever the first chapter. The rest of the chapters are where a man learns what his responsibilities will cost him. I kept those things to myself, not because I didn't want witnesses, but because some things that are alive want to stay alive on their own terms. The forest has rules that are older than our best intentions. I had been welcomed into a conversation I barely understood. For now, I chose to be quiet, to leave the postlight on, to sleep with one ear turned to the dark. The next week, I would learn that keeping a secret in a small town is like keeping a bird beneath your ribs. Eventually, it will want air. But that is a tomorrow. For now, the carved stone rests on my shelf, and the memory of that hand raised in peace presses into my palms like a promise that cannot be easily broken. The carved stone rested on my shelf for a long time. It fit into the drawer beside Linda's letters the way a new cog fits into a slow watch, quietly, invisibly, and with purpose. Days folded into one another after that. The regular chores, the measurements of culverts, the small rituals of a man who'd learned to keep the world on its hinges. But there was always now an extra page in my day reserved for them. I would check the stump in the evening like a fisherman checks a line. I would look up at the tree line each morning, waiting for that first tremor in the understory that meant someone had come. It did not stay small. That summer, the visits changed shape in a way I could not have predicted. At first, they were simple exchanges, bread for pebble, apple for pinecone. Then the medium ones began to leave objects that suggested an attention beyond immediate need, a length of braided vine that might have been a strap, a shallow bowl smoothed from the inside by repetition, a strip of bark etched with scratchings that, to my eye, were arranged like a map. I started to keep a little ledger where I would sketch and note the offerings in their approximate placement. I labeled them in my own clumsy hand. June 16, pebble. June 20, braid of vine. June 24, bark with marks. The ledger kept me honest because it made my private conversation with the forest look like something that could be audited. It never was. 2 weeks in, I started to notice that the family's visits, once centering on the stump at the edge of the clearing, shifted subtly toward the edge of the valley, deeper into the pines where the trunks grew thick, and the light fell like water through glass.
They came later, too, often after my own bedtime, under the cover of the small bustle that comes when temperature drops and the bugs go quiet. They were cautious about crossing the threshold of human places. They respected the porch. They never touched the doorframe. But they began to leave things on the other side of the line that were, unmistakably, invitations. One night, maybe a month from the river, I answered one. The small one, no longer the fragile soaked thing I had plucked from the current, but a spry, puzzled child with brighter hair and a bolder step, came forward on its own accord and tapped the glass of the kitchen window where Linda's radio sat. In the circle of light, the little one held up a small slab of shale with marks on it, lines arranged in a pattern that didn't match anything I'd seen. I opened the screen and took the stone with maltreated fingers. It was warm from where it had been cupped in a palm. Later that week, Ridge came a little closer than before. The first time he let me get a good look from the porch, he stood on the path to the shed and watched me hammer a nail. The way he watched was not the hungry stare of an animal waiting for food. It was a careful study, a man inspecting his neighbor's fence line to see if the boards were sound. Once, when I had paused in my work to wipe my brow, he came so close the porch light picked out the ridge of hair at his jaw. He didn't touch anything. He just set a flat, roughly carved piece of wood on the step and put his hand over it, palm down. Raised hand. Peace. A few nights after that, Ridge made a motion I did not expect. Without crossing my threshold, he tapped his chest slowly, touched chest, then extended his arm and set a rock at the base of the cedar tree that held Linda's photograph. The rock had been smoothed to a gentle shape and bore a shallow groove, the very same sign I'd found under the stone at the stump when I'd first cataloged their gifts. I remember the way the moonlight pooled on that rock and how small and absurd it felt to be the keeper of a pebble left by something no one would believe. I found myself arranging it next to Linda's frame with a care that bordered on ritual. The word for what Ridge was doing does not exist in the world I grew up in. He was mapping a relationship, not marking territory. It was as if he had found a line that ran between us, and like a good forester, he was marking points along it so it could be followed without fear. Then Fish and Wildlife came. It wasn't dramatic at first. People in small towns talk, sometimes in gravel and sometimes with that slow, cautious measurement that I had learned to use when talking about grief. A trucker from over the ridge reported seeing strange tracks near a logging road. Someone else mentioned hearing a low vocalization at night. From such half-threads, rumors spun a pattern fast enough to catch the attention of professionals who had an appetite for patterns.
Tom Patterson showed up on a hot Thursday with the quiet authority of a man who'd spent his life negotiating between the county's needs and the wild's demands. He was a neighbor. His father used to cobble through a leaky fence with my old wrench. Tom was first up the lane, wearing boots that had seen better days and the kind of baseball cap that had water stains around the seams. I made coffee and handed him a mug without asking why he was there. He was careful when he spoke. "We're getting calls," he said simply. "Tracks, some folks hearing or seeing something. Not our first rodeo with curious hikers or pranksters, but I thought I'd let you know they're going to do a sweep. Dr. Sarah Mills' team. They want to set a couple of cameras and maybe take some casts if they find prints." My chest folded in a way I hadn't expected. The ledger, the carved branch in the drawer, the rock by Linda's photo, all of it felt suddenly vulnerable in a way words can't quite cover. I told Tom, the truth and the lie at once, that I'd seen something, but nothing to spin into a headline. I told them they'd find only what the forest wanted found. Tom nodded in that small, neighborly way, but I could see his mind racing past my fence line, toward evidence and toward duty. "If you see anything out of the ordinary, call me," he said. "We don't want to panic, but we also don't want somebody hurt out here." They came the next morning with a truck that smelled like stamped metal and coffee, and a trailer that carried more gear than a camping store. Dr. Sarah Mills walked with a gait that was at once brisk and sure. She had a notepad, binoculars, and a smile that carried both curiosity and the polite restraint of someone trained to observe without contaminating a scene. Behind her was Kevin Chen, young and eager, the kind of assistant who could turn a tangle of data into something presentable. They were polite, professional, and, most important for what happened next, not hungry for spectacle. They set cameras in the soft places I suggested and took careful measurements of the prints I showed them. Kevin watched my ledger with an intensity that betrayed his appetite for detail. They asked questions about recent logging, about traps, about local hunters who might have left something behind. Those were their real concerns. When you work in the field, you worry about broken things,
Snares left by poachers, abandoned traps, devices meant to capture or kill. Their method was methodical, not invasive. They took casts where the mud held an impression and set trail cameras with sticky straps, careful to hide them where a casual passerby wouldn't notice. I watched them work with a stomach that felt like a wrapped stone. There are rules to these things, I told myself. They had a job, I had mine. But I couldn't help watching the places where the cameras were set, the slung straps and the small wedges of white tape that marked their positions.
Those ribbons caught at the edges of my consciousness like a warning. Fish and wildlife is not the same thing as a court of law. They want evidence, sure, but they also want to know there's nothing dangerous in the equation. No injured animals suffering in silence, no man putting himself in harm's way. To Tom and Sarah, a discovery must be handled with restraint. To me, the idea of the forest being pulled into the bright scrutiny of their cameras felt like watching a bird being measured for its wing, rather than being left to fly. 2 days after they arrived, the trail camera near the ditch picked up movement. 2 silhouettes passing at dusk. The image was grainy, the kind that makes limbs into brush and heads into lumps. Kevin called it promising. Sarah called it ambiguous. Tom called it an indication to broaden the sweep. They found additional prints near the shelter I had half-guessed at weeks earlier, a slight hollow in the ground beyond the line of birch, protected by fallen limbs and the carpet of needles. One of the casts they took that day matched, in proportion and spacing, the impressions I had been sketching in my ledger. They whispered among themselves, in the way that professionals do when a hypothesis tightens into something plausible. I argued with myself for a day about whether to tell them more. There was a part of me that wanted a relief so fierce it felt like a liquefied thing, an exhale that would mean I was not crazy. Another part, the one imbued with whatever respect Linda had taught me for living things in their places, wanted to hide whatever I could. What frightened me most was not the team's presence. It was the idea that their light might strip the family of the only advantage they had, the dark. One afternoon, while Sarah was measuring the depth of a print with a little caliber, and Kevin was carefully bagging a sample of lichen from a nearby log, I noticed something odd on the ground between the cameras and the shelter site. A length of rawhide, coiled and terribly old, lay half-buried beneath needles. It was set with a small circular jaw of iron I recognized by sight alone, the kind left from a long unattended trap. In my line of work, you learn to spot things that don't belong. The trap looked like a relic left back in a time when men were less careful about the consequences. I said nothing at first. I watched for a minute too long. Sarah was stern when she saw it. Her hands went to it as if the leather had asked for help, her face folded into somber lines. She did not jump to any lurid conclusion. She simply said, "This should not be here," and told Kevin to call in the county's enforcement for disposal. There was a sadness to her voice that didn't need the words to register. Someone had left this where animals might stumble into it. That night, I sat on the porch with the radio turned low. Hank slept with his nose tucked between my boots. There was a pressure in my chest that felt like a fist.
I thought of the way the family moved in the trees like a tide, and of the small one's bright eyes, and old spring images of legal snares in a hunter's lore clicked through my mind like a warning bell. I thought of a trap and a creature with joints too large for a human frame to negotiate, and my hands grew cold as if the river had returned. I went out before dawn. The sun hadn't made up its mind, and the valleys smelled of damp leaves and the heat before summer rejoiced. I walked the path toward the shelter, the way I'd walk past someone else's house, respectfully, with a little head down. My boots made low sounds on the needle mat. At the edge of the hollow, I stopped dead. There was a piece of red cloth tied to the fork of a young birch, a strip no larger than a handkerchief but bright as blood against the muted greens. I had never seen a red cloth left by the family. They left tidy gifts and respectful markings. Red had always been absent. In the ledger I had, in the margin, an old notation from when Border Patrol used colored flags to indicate danger on wildlands. Red means danger, white means safe. I had no right to that code, but the sight of the flag jarred me the way an alarm does. A sound made me look down. The small one stood a few yards away, eyes wide and head cocked. It had its hand pressed to its chest. Touch chest. Self. It was alone. And beside it, caught in the stuff of a cruelly designed artifact, was Ridge. He was not thrashing, but he had not the luxury of not being hurt. One of his legs was clamped in the trap's iron, and blood matted the fur where it had been rubbed raw. He had not howled or made the huge sounds that would call the family.
He had made a low, shaking hum, a punctuation that rose and broke like a small wave. The small one had come to me and stared as if asking me what I could do. Everything slowed to a single consequential point. The red flag was not a message for me, it was a message for them and for any human who might stumble upon the hollow. It said, danger. Someone had placed a thing where an animal might be ensnared and had not cared enough to remove it. It was the sort of thing that made the hair dry out of your head. I moved without thinking, which is a different kind of thinking, the muscle memory of years of wrestling with wood and wire and stubborn things. I knelt and looked at the iron. There was no time for fancy tools. The trap had teeth that were meant to pinch and hold. Ridge's eyes flicked to me. He did not lash out. He looked with a tired intelligence that read like a ledger. When I touch something like that, I do it with the same care I would cradle a sprout. My hands had a scent that was all the ordinary work of my life, sawdust and coffee and the faint scent of Linda's soap that lingered in the cabinet. I spoke to Ridge in fragments. Words matter little in those moments, but the sound of a human voice has a habit of making the world move at human speed.
He watched me with a closeness that made the world contract. Hank patted softly and then pressed himself against my hip like a living weight. The iron was cruel but not impossible. I worked to free him, wrapping a cloth to protect my hands, levering cautiously to loosen the jaws and pry them away from the fur without making a thing worse. Ridge's breathing was shallow. His shoulders jerked once, and he hummed against the chorus of birds waking. I could feel the press of him, enormous in the small hollow, and the pulse in his thigh under my hand like a drum beat. When the trap finally let go, the sound it made was small and awful, a clink and a sigh. Ridge folded into himself as if trying to compress a lifetime into a small space, and then, with a movement that felt both relieved and wary, pushed himself up on trembling legs. He did not leap away. He stood and looked at me, not like an animal that fled danger, but like a man whose neighbor had fixed his roof. He tapped his chest with his great palm, touched chest, and then placed his hand over mine. It was the most human and the most other gesture I had ever felt, an immense warmth over the small practical work of release. For a second, the forest held its breath. The small one whapped the air in a quick motion I later learned meant gratitude. Ridge looked toward the tree line, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of me, but of the metal and the red cloth and the idea that something human had left this in a place meant for creatures. The red flag had been intended perhaps to warn something else, but the warning was unable to reverse the harm. I would have lashed Ridge's leg then if I had the means, made a wrap, carried him to the truck, but that would have been an imposition, and he declined it with a look that said simply, not here. He would not be loaded into an unnatural place. Instead, he limped a few paces and then lay down in the circle of spruce smell, and the family gathered around him like a chorus closing a door. They hummed. Ridge made low sounds that rose and fell in a cadence we stumbled over with our human ears. The small one pressed its forehead to Ridge's shoulder. It was private and public at the same time. When I turned back toward the road, Sarah, was standing by the edge of the trail with Tom and Kevin. They had arrived quietly, the kind of quiet that comes from being out in the field. Sarah's face was drawn with worry, and when she stepped forward, she did not carry a notebook. She carried an expression that belonged to someone who had to reconcile the sedate curiosity of science with the immediate need of life. "You did good," she said to me, and I could not tell if there was a reprimand beneath her braze. "We would have found that iron sooner or later. But you," she stopped, looking at Ridge and then back at me, "you did the right thing." It would have been easy to spin the moment into a showdown, to wave my arms and declare my private right to be an arbiter of a wild secret. But Sarah's look had something honest in it. She did not want to take Ridge. She wanted to know how best to help something that might die if it was taken. "We need to treat that leg," she said at last. "We can fashion a splint, stabilize the wound. We can sedate for transport if he needs it." Ridge heard the word sedate, and his posture tightened. He reached out and placed his palm against his own sternum, touched chest, and then extended his hand toward me, the same hand that had rested against mine earlier. It was, in its own way, a request. Not to be trapped by medical kindness, perhaps, but to allow aid on his terms. Tom, who had grown up around me, looked at me with that old, soft skepticism. He and I had shared a coffin of roadside lunches and an understanding that sometimes the right thing looked ugly from the outside. He asked quietly, "What do you think, Gary?" I could have told them the truth, that medicine in a truck and a handful of bandages wouldn't fit a creature like Ridge, and that the better course for him was to be made safe and left with the family. I could have told them that the family had ways, if we watched and listened and fed them,
that would let them heal without being hauled away and dissected for knowledge. I could have also told them that if Ridge's leg was infected and left too long, he might not survive. If he couldn't move, the family could not stay in the same places and would be forced to wander and risk encroaching on humans. There were no easy ethical equations here. "Let us try to help him here," I said. "We can make a splint, we can treat the wound on site. Pack up some of your gear. Sarah, you can consult, and we will do what we can without putting him in a vehicle." Sarah closed her mouth like a person who had considered the possibilities and chosen the one that did the least harm. "On your word, Gary," she said. "You know more of this place than we do." We moved then in the hush of people doing necessary things. Kevin fetched a wooden board from the trailer, and Tom brought a roll of gauze. I carried a thermos of hot coffee because there is always coffee. Ridge watched us like a patient watching a timid doctor, his eyes tracking every movement. He did not flinch when we cleansed the wound with water heated from a stove. Rather, he hummed the way someone hums to study a boat. I can still see his eyes, thick-lidded, patient, while Sarah and Tom worked with gentle interventions, cutting and wrapping, improvising what they could from boards and cloth. They did not rustle or force anything. They worked with a kind of cultural humility I hadn't expected. When it was done, Ridge sat up and tested the leg cautiously. Pain bowed his face for a moment, then eased enough that he could stand. He didn't linger.
He hobbled a few steps, then sat on his haunches and rested his head on the small one's shoulder. The family was not cured, but the immediate crisis had lessened. Sarah took photographs and cast another careful print at a respectful distance. Kevin transcribed notes in a shaking hand. As they packed, Sarah came to me and asked the question all forest people know how to ask, though it is rarely asked in polite company. "If we find them better protected, will you work with us to set up an exclusion zone, education, a monitoring plan that involves the community rather than sensational headlines?" My answer was simple. Only if what you do keeps the privacy of where they sleep and who cares for them. If the trade is cameras for open access, no. If the trade is respect and no public release, then maybe. She looked at me for a long moment. "We can't make promises, Gary," she said, "but we'll do our best to not cause harm." They left with the trays of tools and a sense of careful victory. They took casts and data, but left our names unshouted. In the weeks that followed, the trail cameras picked up a smudge of movement now and then, but never the clear, ridiculous image the tabloids would have wanted. The prints were more carefully documented. Tom and Sarah would report inconclusive results to the county, evidence of large unknowns, but nothing definitive enough to warrant headlines. They were professionals. They knew the difference between proof and invasion. The family moved their sleeping places deeper into the valley for a time, but the stump exchanges did not cease. If anything, they became richer in small, careful gifts. Ridge, or perhaps a council of adults, left a piece of wood carved not with a simple notch, but with a shallow pictograph. It showed a river and a line interrupted by a small figure, and then a larger figure with a wave beneath. It was a story I read as we might read a child's picture book. Rescue, river, thanks. It felt like a covenant carved into a plain stick. A month after the trap, I sat on the porch and pulled the carved branch from the drawer beside Linda's letters. The wood smelled like moss and rain. I set it next to the pictograph Ridge had left, aligned them like things that belong on a mantle. Together they told a story, the night I pulled a small life from the river, and the later night when I pulled Ridge from an iron. The ledger closed upon itself in a neat way only my heart could see. The small one grew. That is the most human thing in a way that unsettles me. In August, it was startling to realize the child had the length of limb and length of curiosity equivalent to a human of 5 or 6. He followed me sometimes when I repaired a fence, his little stride matching the rhythm of my own steps. Ridge would watch the pair from the margin of the woods, a careful hunter of a different sort, watchful, present, not intrusive. Once, Ridge came down to the shed and helped me lift a beam I could not have handled alone.
He did not take pride in the work like some man. Instead, he carried the load as if it were an offering. That winter, when a wind broke off a limb and smashed my chicken coop, it was Ridge who, with the family, came before dawn and helped me right the structure. They worked in a manner as quiet and efficient as a crew of old hands, and when they finished, Ridge set a carved slug of wood against the corner, gently, like a signature. In town, people whispered. The ledger on my desk sat like a secret between me and the paper. There were moments when some idiot hunter would brag at the bar about going ghost-sniffing along the ridges, and I'd watch them make faces that meant they wanted the stories to be blood and chase, rather than small, odd, true things. Once, a kid with a pickup and a television antenna became brazen enough to set up a tent near the road to catch something. Tom, who had the patience of a man who grew up around the loop of rumor, found the kid and politely suggested the town was not a stage. I liked that about Tom. He understood humans and animals both needed breathing room. There were other bumps. One August evening, some city folk passing for the weekend left beer cans near the trail and then posted the trailhead on a bulletin board with a crude map. That post went down fast. I'd seen the same kind of publicity eat a place thin. I took the scissors and cut the paper from its peg, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and burned it in the stove. It was not a heroic move. It was simply preventative. Secrets, once in the world, move quicker than remedies. As the months folded into a year, the small one traveled from curiosity into mischief and back again. He had a particular fascination with the way my dog, Hank, slept in strange positions, and with the jars of preserves lined on the pantry shelf. Once he stole a jar and left behind a chain of woven grass. I found the jar on my table and the chain at the stump. Gifts are a language they speak in. The family, for their part, showed signs of a culture, little routines and repeated marks. They kept sheltered caches of gathered food in hollow logs and under the root flares of cedars. They favored particular trails where the understory was thinned in the right manner. Ridge and the adults carved stones and sticks with simple notches that appeared in consistent patterns. One night, Ridge led me farther than I had ever walked with him, into a small valley that was like a room in the earth, a hollow that a small creek carved out with patience. Within that hollow was a shelter constructed out of bent saplings and moss, rudimentary but clever. The adults had arranged bedding, strips of bark, woven grasses, around a hearth of stones that hinted at a controlled fire. On a flat slab was an arrangement of stones and a row of carved marks on a piece of slate. I remember sitting at the lip of that hollow with Ridge and listening as he hummed.
He did not speak English, but there was a cadence to his sound, a slow lullaby, low notes that went up and then rounded down. It was neither song nor speech, but it held meaning the way punctuation holds a paragraph together. He tapped the slate with a thick, calloused finger. The marks looked less like random scratches now and more like symbols, simple pictographs that represented things: a river, an adult, a child, a shelter, a tree. Ridge tapped his chest and then tapped the symbol for shelter. He then reached and tapped my hand and the symbol for a house. It was perhaps the closest thing to an invitation. Come into our world, look, and then go back. I did not cross into the shelter that first time. I sat at the margin and felt like a guest who had been shown the interior of a household and told to look respectfully. Later, on another night when the family had a longer trust with me, Ridge allowed me to come in. The smell of earth and chartreuse moss enveloped me. The air was warm and had the damp quality of a root cellar, and inside were possessions laid with the same careful thought humans put into their kitchens: a pile of small tines, a pebble marked with a groove, a length of vine neatly coiled. Each had its place. On a flat stone I found a small arrangement that took my breath away, a line of pebbles set in descending size like an abacus, and beside them a small carved stick with notches that matched the pattern of the wood Ridge had once left on my stump. He reached for my hand and pressed them together, the tokens of exchange. He tapped the pebble line and hummed, then pressed his hand to his chest and then to me. It was gratitude and reciprocity made tactile. Their intelligence was not like ours. It didn't map onto our categories easily, but intelligence is relational. The way they made tools, the way they arranged food stores, the way they altered their shelter with a thought for weather and children, all of it testified to minds that thought ahead and cared for kin. Ridge had a mind that measured, planned, and made offerings. He was not a brute. He was a being with a cultural thread I was privileged to glimpse. Time wore on. The small one grew taller, his hair thicker and his curiosity broader. At one point in late fall, after a long season of shared small tasks, I built a simple cedar shelf and mounted it near the stove. On it I placed Linda's photograph, and beside it the carved branch, the pictograph, the smooth stone with the shallow groove. I carved a small notch into the shelf for each significant day: the river, the carved branch, the trap, the shelter. It became my ledger in wood. There are moments in life when you feel old things settle into place. My grief, which had been a raw thing that sometimes made me forgo breakfast, became a cord that pulled in a slow, steady loop. The children of the valley, human and otherwise, found their places around my kitchen table in different ways.
Sometimes Kevin stopped by with extra field rations. Sometimes Tom would bring a hand-forged hook. We shared coffee, and when we told stories, we did not make monsters of what we had found. We tried to protect what was alive rather than argue about it. Then, as the year rounded toward the cold months, a test of a different kind came. A group of students from a university, heavy with badges of curiosity and permission letters, began asking questions at the general store. They carried notebooks and asked about my property line in a way that made Tom frown. Word travels. People think curiosity is a harmless thing, but curiosity can become a ladder into a sleeping room.
I caught wind of them after a phone call from Tom. They're organized, he said. Sarah told them to back off, but there are other groups, people asking the wrong questions. The way he said it made my hands find the edge of the table. That night, I sat in the dark with Hank and thought about responsibility as something that reaches beyond law and ethic. I had a choice then that would define the rest of the story. We could try to take photos, gather data, make an argument that would protect them by turning them into a species that needed saving. Or we could do the riskier, lonelier thing. Keep the secret, keep the family moving and safe, and be the small, stubborn heart that says no to the world on behalf of a life that did not ask to be a demonstration. The decision was less romantic than it sounds. It was practical. Once you invite others into a secret, you cannot control the way they tell it. You cannot always control the people who will come, the exploiters and the naive in equal measure. The ledger in my drawer had a line through it. I folded it back into the top drawer and left the key to the house in the bowl where I kept nails. I started leaving the white cloth. White cloth had been a thing my grandfather had used in the woods to mark a safe route for loggers. White meant pass, red meant caution. I tied bits of white cloth along the lower limbs of the trees that edged the family's most beloved trails, a kind of human-made code that read for them as a promise. Follow this, and you will not find whistles and flashing lights. To the others who might walk the path without reading the code, the white cloth would seem like nothing more than a foolish bit of cloth. For Ridge and his people, though, there was meaning in the repetition. They learned to read it as a human contrivance that could offer an exit without exposure. The months that followed stretched into a rhythm. The family would retreat deeper when outsiders were about, then peek back when things calmed. I would repair fences, fix broken ponds to keep the ducks from wandering into the wrong places, and stand on my porch like a sentry who does nothing flashy but watches. It is not a glamorous life. It is a life of small actions that add up.
Some nights we shared silent rituals. Ridge would leave a length of vine on my porch railing. I would set out bread at the stump. Once, after a particularly hard week of loneliness and rain, I found a small circle of moss on my kitchen table with a pebble in the center. Touch chest. Self. It was like waking up to find a friend had made you a cup of coffee. Years passed like that, more quietly than drama permits, and with more weight than rumor can carry. Hank grew old and then quieter, until the day he didn't get up from the porch. I buried him beneath the cedar, and Ridge and the small one came and stood at the edge of the mound. They made a low chorus I took as mourning, and Ridge left a carved stick upright in the soil near the head. It looked like a staff and a tombstone at once. Grief repeated in a way I didn't expect. Linda's absence remained a constant thread, but the presence of Ridge and his family stitched a new kind of fabric into my life. They gave me tasks again. Watch for traps, mark the trails, keep secrets, and those tasks kept me alive. Then, one winter night that smelled of frost and the stone-cold silence of a lonely sky, something happened that reminded me how close the line between care and catastrophe always sits. A man with a hunting license, inexperienced and thoughtless, had decided to set a trap deeper in our valley, someone who had learned old habits and hadn't known how much damage one rusted jaw could make. The trap was an old design, left over and lazy, and the consequences, when it met a creature with Ridge's leg breadth, were immediate. It was not Ridge this time, but one of the medium ones, the brother of the small one, who tripped the wrong device. The family's cry that night was different. Not the low hum I'd learned to read, but a jagged, rising sound that made the hairs on my arms stand. I turned and ran, not bothering my boots, the way a man runs toward a fire. They had moved the trap further than I'd guessed, closer to a slough where the family liked to fetch frogs. I saw him there, caught, and my chest folded like a letter being read. There was no time for the slow politeness of surgery. I ripped at the thing with my bare hands in a fury that felt half panic, half necessity. Ridge was there in a heartbeat, along with Tom, who had followed my light with a farmer's instinct. Together, we freed the creature. The injury was bad. The leg had been badly bruised and the skin rubbed raw, but we managed to splint it and get him to a safe hollow where he could rest. After that night, the town tightened like a fist around the concept of responsibility. The hunter, when we found him, was less a villain than a man who had not considered the consequences of old habits. He admitted his ignorance and agreed to help remove other traps from the area. He and I spent long, uncomfortable days together, walking ridgelines and dismantling the rusted jaws people had abandoned.
I didn't relish it. I resented the way these things kept happening because humans could not be bothered to change old ways. But I also understood that when you make a mistake, the proper thing is to fix it. The family healed gradually. The median one limped for a while and then walked again. The small one grew into a lanky youth who began to bring me twigs shaped into crude arrowheads, useless perhaps, but earnest. Ridge never came into my house for long. He respected the threshold as if it were a sanctified thing. But he and I spoke more in gestures and in small notches. Once he brought me a length of cord and an edge of leather cut by some tool his hands had fashioned. He placed it on the shelf and tapped my chest and the leather in turn. It was a message I read plainly. Trust. Years rounded themselves into a long quiet. Sarah and Kevin moved on to other projects. Tom retired with a face like a softened stone and a library of good decisions behind him. The town settled into its pattern of suspicion and folklore. People still told stories at the diner, men with weathered faces full of a kind of wonder, and the tales shifted with the teller. I let them talk. Rumor, I've learned, is a kind of safe container for human fear. It allows people to say a monstrous thing and then go back to work. My ledger filled with more than notes. It collected a life. I would scratch dates on the inside lip of the cedar shelf near Linda's photograph. The river rescue, the carved branch, the trap, the shelter reveal, the nights of mutual aid. It was an inventory of meaning more than an account of evidence. Each notch counted not a proof, but a responsibility. One late summer evening, years after the river had first given me that small shaking body, Ridge came alone to the edge of my clearing. The family usually came as a whole, whether to feast or to thank. This night he stepped out like a man who had come to a necessary appointment. He set a rock at my stoop and placed beside it a thin piece of slate with a pictograph more complex than any I'd seen. Curved lines, dots, and a small figure pointing. He tapped his chest, then tapped the slate, then looked at me. I understood then. Something in their culture had matured to the point of intentionality beyond the individual. They were, in their way, inviting me to be a keeper. It wasn't a request so much as an offering. Will you watch over this? Will you keep your place in our story? My answer was the same I had lived all those years. I took the slate and put it beside Linda's picture and the carved branch. I pressed my hand to my chest. Touch chest. Self. It was more honest than a promise, because promises can be broken. It was simply the acknowledgement that I was present and that I would do what I could. The months that followed were as steady and domestic as bread on a shelf.
I found solace in small objects left at my door. A shell, a cleverly woven length of grass, a small figurine carved in wood. And I let things in return. A soldered tin lid, a jar lid to drill holes for draining, a coil of rope. The family adapted to the white cloth markers and learned to avoid roads and people. The small one, no longer small, learned my morning comings and goings, like someone learning a route to school. And then, on the afternoon when the maple had kept its leaves until a late frost, I found a new gift on the cedar shelf. It was small and round and light enough to hold in the palm of my hand, a bead of carved bone. On it, shallowly incised, were the symbols we had shared, the river, the notches, the shelter. Ridge had made it and left it by Linda's picture. I set it beside her frame, and for a moment the house did not feel like a place of absence. It was simply a place where two different forms of family had found a shared space. You might ask, when it comes to treasures like this, what the world owes to truth. My answer is simple. Not everything that is true belongs in the light. Some truths are covenants of silence, and the keeping of them requires a bravery that is not flashy. It requires small acts over long periods, mending fences, removing traps, leading curious folk away from the right tracks, teaching a child to pack out their trash. It is the opposite conquest. It is stewardship. The Fish and Wildlife team left records in their own files. They filed reports of unidentified large mammal activity and trod carefully in the margins of their paperwork. Sarah came back once to consult sometime later, and the conversation we had was the kind of adult conversation that treats life as complicated. She wanted to help, I wanted privacy. We reached a middle path that favored the living thing over evidence. Kevin, who eventually became a professor and then a gentle skeptic about the possibility of proof, would stop by to tell me about students who had learned to be more cautious when they went into the field. Tom called sometimes to say he had shot a brake job at the sheriff's office. We were all, in our ways, part of a small network of people with an ethic. Years went on. I grew older and my hair more salt than pepper. Linda stayed in the photograph and in the way I set 2 plates on the table when I ate. The ledger in the drawer had more entries than it began with. A list of objects, a catalog of nights, a record of the family's growth. The small one courted independence and then came back to teach his own small ones the way to weave a shelter. And I kept watch. People ask me if I ever regretted the secret. They think secrets are sins to be confessed. My answer is honest and complicated. I regret nothing that kept a living thing from being dragged into the glare. I regret the traps that people left by thoughtlessness. I regret the nights when I failed to do enough. But keeping this secret, This impossible, tender thing gave me work and a focus that pulled my grief into useful shapes. I tended the margins of their life because no one else had chosen to do it. That is not heroism. It is a contract of need. Sometimes on summer evenings, Ridge would come to the edge of the clearing with the small one and stand in the long light. We'd sit on the porch and drink coffee, and they'd look at me like a man looks at the sky, familiar and part of something bigger than his own hands. Once Ridge set a carved stick against the cedar shelf, with the same pictographs that now read like a family chronicle. I put my hand over my chest and pressed my palm to the wood in return, and the gesture felt as binding as any oath. The last time I saw Ridge up close, he came alone and left a long, smooth piece of wood carved into a gentle curve. I set it beside Linda's photograph, beside the shelf, and ran my thumb along the notch. It was like reading a page in a book where the last sentence sums everything up. Rescue begets rescue. We are each other's keepers, in ways both terrible and beautiful. Ridge tapped his chest, then tapped the wood, then mine. He turned, and with a slow, respectful bow of his great head, melted back into the trees. There are things I have learned in this life that you do not teach in classrooms. The value of being quiet, the difference between curiosity and intrusion, the ways in which simple kindness can ripple outward and change the trajectory of a creature's life. I learned how to watch without wanting to own what I see. I learned how to act when no one else sees. I learned to carry a secret like a child who must not be woken. If you ever come to this valley, you will not find a sign that says, "Here be Bigfoot." You will find a man who keeps lit a lamp on his porch and a cedar shelf that holds a carved branch and a photograph of a woman named Linda. You will find a few white cloths tied low on the trees that mean, "Here, be safe." And you might see, if you're lucky, and if you have the patience and humility to watch without taking, the silhouette of a large figure standing in the margins, Ridge or one of his kin, observing the world in the way that animals do, and in the way that some humans do when they think of home. Sometimes, on the river itself, I think of that first morning. The water had been vicious with the melt, and a small, shivering thing looked me square in the eye, as if it had always known me. I pulled it from the current, and in doing so, pulled my life onto a different axis. I had no idea at the time how heavy the debt would be, or how gentle the repayment. They repaid me with presents. They repaid me with gifts that were more like questions. Will you keep what we are? Will you protect what cannot speak our language? I said yes. I have said yes in 1,000 small ways since then. I have said yes by leaving bread at a stump, by taking down a flimsy notice, by teaching a boy to unmake a trap.
I have said yes by marking white cloth on the trees, and by telling Tom when he wandered too near. I have said yes by keeping a secret that kept them alive. If this story means anything, it is this: rescue can change everything. What begins as a single action, reaching into a cold river, hauling a wet thing to dry land, can ripple outward into a life of meaning that is quieter and stranger than people imagine. It can transform loneliness into a life of guardianship. It can give a man a reason to do the small, stubborn, necessary things that make for a life worth living. I do not know what will happen when I am gone. I do not know if another pair of hands will take up the ledger and tie the white cloths. I only know this: for years I kept a small community alive by doing the unglamorous work of care. That work matters more, in the end, than any photograph or proof. The family is not ours to possess. They are ours, at most, to protect. If you have your own stories of a strange encounter in the woods, a night when you felt watched and found it a blessing, tell them in the comments. If you want more slow, long-form encounters like this, subscribe and you'll find others. But if you take one thing from my rambling, let it be this: sometimes what saves you is what you choose to save. I set the kettle on the stove and watch the steam rise in a small, steady thread, and when the sun goes down, I leave the porch light on and wait. Somewhere in the trees, Ridge's family moves like a river's current, patient, intentional, and old as the wood itself.
At night, when the wind is just so and the river hums in its bed, I can imagine the small one's head tilting in the way it did that morning in the current. I can see Ridge's great palm lifted in the old gesture of peace, and I know that the night we first met, I did more than save a single life from the river. I found a family that saved me back in ways that are quiet and profound, and the promise of guarding them has become a reason to wake up and keep the doors shut against harm. So I keep the secret. I watch the ledger on the shelf. I press my hand to my chest. Touch, chest, self. I will keep watch as long as I'm able. The river remembers the day I waded into it. But the river is not the only thing that remembers. The family remembers too. And every night they come to the edge of the clearing and return to their hollow with the knowledge that a man, an ordinary man, has honored his dead. That to me is enough.